Welcome to What's a 100-Year Flood? Part 1, Basic Definition. So sometimes we hear a particularly bad flood referred to as a 100-year flood. And similarly, a large storm might be called a 100-year storm. In this video, we're going to talk about what this 100-year, or 500-year, or 1,000-year term means. So this video will be a good illustration of Poisson statistics in everyday life. There is a Poisson statistics playlist on this channel which you might want to check out first if you're not familiar with the Poisson distribution. At a given location, one can define a threshold, for example in terms of river flow rate or depth, such that a flood would meet or exceed that threshold, on average, only once every 100 years. We call a flood that meets or exceeds this threshold a 100-year flood. These rare events are taken to be independent and have a constant probability of occurring per unit time. So the probability of one of these floods occurring, say, in the next year is the same regardless of whether the last such flood occurred last year or 150 years ago. Now, a process that has a constant probability of occurring per unit time is described by the Poisson distribution. For a Poisson process which occurs on average lambda times in some time interval, the probability for it to occur n times in that interval is given by the Poisson distribution, shown here. So let's look at the probability of a 100-year flood occurring n times for some different time intervals. Okay, so first of all, let's look at the case where our time interval is a century. What is the probability of exactly one 100-year flood in that time? 2 of them? None at all? So the average number of 100-year floods in a century is 1. That's the definition of a 100-year flood. So we set lambda equal to 1 in our Poisson distribution formula, and we get that the probability of n 100-year floods occurring in 1 century is e to the minus 1 over n factorial. Okay, so let's evaluate this for a few values of n. Let's start with n equals 0. So we plug n equals 0 into our Poisson distribution formula for lambda equal to 1, and we get approximately 0.3679. So this tells us that there's an approximately 37% chance that no 100-year flood occurs in a given century, and that means that there's an approximately 63% chance that at least one occurs. Okay, so now let's check out the case n equals 1. So we plug in n equals 1 to our Poisson distribution formula for lambda equals 1, and again we get 0.3679-ish. So this means that there's also about a 37% chance of exactly one 100-year flood occurring in a given century. So note that this means that there is an approximately 63% chance of less than or greater than one 100-year flood occurring in any given century. So most 100-year intervals don't have exactly one 100-year flood. Okay, so next let's look at the cases of n equals 2 and n equals 3. So we plug those values into our Poisson distribution formula again, and we get that the probability of 2 100-year floods occurring in a century is about 18%, and the probability of 3 100-year floods occurring in a century is about 6%. So it's definitely possible to have more than one 100-year flood in a century. Okay, so now what about long timescales? Let's look at a timescale of 150 years. So in 150 years, we would expect, on average, 1.5 100-year floods. So we set lambda equal to 1.5 in our Poisson distribution formula. So here we've shown the probabilities of getting n equals 0, 1, 2, or 3 100-year floods in 150 years. The most likely case is that we get 1, but the probability of getting 0 or 2 or 3 is not that small, and in fact the probability of getting more than 3 is even 7%. Okay, so what about 300 years? So on average we would expect 3 100-year floods in 300 years, So we set lambda equal to 3, and this gives the probabilities shown here. And I'd just like to point out that even in 300 years, there's a 5% chance of going without a single 100-year flood in that time interval. So it is not uncommon to have, at a certain location, more than one 100-year flood in a given century, or to have no 100-year floods at that location for time periods somewhat longer than a century. We took 100-year floods as Poisson distributed, and the probability of a Poisson distributed event occurring per unit time is constant. So if you just had a 100-year flood in your town last year, that doesn't mean you can't have one now. And if you haven't had a 100-year flood in your town for 120 years, that doesn't mean that you're due for one. Okay, so now let's look at some intermediate timescales. So what's the probability of having 0 or 1 or 2 100-year floods occurring in a 10-year time interval? So now the average number of 100-year floods in 10 years is 0.1, so we set lambda equal to 0.1 in our Poisson distribution formula, and we find that the probability of having no 100-year floods in a decade is about 90.5%. The probability of having 1 is about 9%, and the probability of having 2 or more is about 0.5%. Okay, so now let's look at 30 years. So here we set lambda equal to 0.3, and we find that the probability of having 0 100-year floods in 30 years is about 74%. The probability of having 1 is about 22%, and so on. So there's about a 22% chance that there will be one 100-year flood in 30 years, and about a 3% chance that there will be 2. So the probability of 1 or more in 30 years is not small. Okay, so here we've seen the definition of a 100-year flood. The occurrence of 100-year floods is assumed to be Poisson distributed. And for a Poisson distributed process, the probability of an event occurring per unit time is a constant. For a flood-prone location, we expect a 100-year flood to occur once every 100 years, on average. However, this does not imply that a 100-year flood occurs at a given location exactly once every 100 years. A 100-year flood having just occurred does not preclude another one from occurring, and likewise, if a 100-year flood has not occurred for close to or more than 100 years, that does not increase the probability of one occurring now. Okay, so we should note that our description of 100-year floods in this video has been a little simplistic. We'll cover some issues with the above discussion in a companion video, What's a 100-Year Flood? Part 2, Complications.